In today's episode, we're diving into 3 chilling true stories where chasing the perfect selfie led to deadly consequences. From a grisly encounter in Glacier National Park to a private tiger tour in the forest of Ontario. But first, let's start in Brazil, where Marco Oliveira thought he could snap the ultimate lion selfie and became the story instead. On June 17, 2014, the morning sun rose over the São Paulo Wildlife Park in Brazil, casting golden streaks across dew-slick walkways and rustling palm fronds. The park was quiet, hours from the buzz of tourists. Inside, birds rustled in their enclosures, and somewhere near the back, a lion's low rumble echoed off stone. It was a day like any other, or so it appeared. Marco Oliveira, a 32-year-old senior zookeeper, arrived earlier than usual. He had done this many times before, always quiet, always punctual. His co-workers knew him as soft-spoken, often keeping to himself during breaks, sometimes skipping group lunches altogether. He wasn't antisocial, just content in silence. The zoo for Marco was more than a job, it was his world. He lived alone in a modest one-bedroom apartment less than a mile from the park entrance. He had no close family in São Paulo. His parents had retired to a rural town in the south, and his older brother had moved abroad years ago. Marco rarely talked about them, he rarely traveled, rarely took time off, and never strayed far from his routine. On weekends, even when he wasn't scheduled to work, he would walk the zoo's outer paths, jotting down notes on animal behavior or photographing enclosure designs he admired. Among the animals, Marco was known, trusted, especially in the carnivore section where he'd worked for years. He spoke to them like old friends, even the more temperamental ones seemed calmer around him. That connection wasn't just professional, for Marco it was deeply personal. A few months before the incident, Marco had been assigned an additional role by park management, overseeing the zoo's social media accounts. It wasn't part of his original job, but with his eye for photography and quiet dedication to the animals, he seemed like a natural fit. Management wanted more visibility, and Marco began posting updates, feeding sessions, close-ups of the animals, morning routines. At first, it was just part of his routine, but gradually the boundaries between care and content began to blur. Before he was asked to manage the zoo's social media, his own accounts were filled with soft-focus animal portraits, rarely selfies. His captions read more like diary entries, quiet observations about the way a jaguar breathed during a nap or how sunlight caught the shimmer of a lizard's scales. To those who worked with him, Marco was dependable to a fault. He never missed a shift, never raised his voice, he wasn't ambitious in the conventional sense, never chasing promotions. But he took pride in consistency. Quiet, steady, unseen by most, but absolutely present. Despite his quiet nature, Marco had embraced the new role the park had offered, managing its social media. He never asked for it, but when the position was offered, he took it seriously. It gave him purpose beyond just feeding schedules and cleaning enclosures. He began taking photos first of the animals, then of himself with the animals. Always at a distance behind fences or glass, sometimes with a colleague nearby to frame the shot. These posts gradually boosted the zoo's online following. Management noticed, so did Marco. Over time, the post became more polished. He learned lighting tricks, angles, hashtags. At 8:43 a.m. that day, 15 minutes before opening, Marco was seen on the facility's high-definition security cameras entering the large predator wing, specifically near the African lion enclosure. He had his feeding gear with him, meat bucket, gloves, boots, but unusually he also held his personal phone. The cameras captured every step. There was no scheduled feeding at that hour, and the senior carnivore keeper who normally oversaw lion protocols was off duty. Marco moved with purpose. CCTV showed him unlocking the secondary gate with 2 codes, his own and a second code he had obtained days earlier by claiming he needed to cover a sick colleague's shift. With no one else present, he bypassed the 2-person safety protocol. He paused at the gateway, glanced back once at the empty corridor, then entered the enclosure's prep chamber. Inside, he partially raised one of the overhead blinds to let in more light. The camera caught him checking the screen of his phone, adjusting it in his hand. He stepped through the final door into the lion enclosure. The enclosure mimicked the Tanzanian savanna, with scattered rocks, a small pond, and a shaded sleeping platform. At the far end, Caesar, the park's star attraction, rested under a tree. The 450-pound male lion was still, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Marco set down the feeding gear like usual, perhaps to make the scene look routine if anyone questioned it later. Then he took a few steps forward, phone in hand, turned his back to Caesar, and began raising the camera. His intent was clear: frame the perfect shot with the lion in the background. Maybe a short video, maybe just a still. Something striking to boost the zoo's morning engagement. At this point, no one else was nearby. The corridor camera showed no other staff in the area. Marco was alone. Caesar's head lifted, his eyes fixed on the shape intruding on his territory. At 8:46 a.m., the lion moved. It began with a low growl, barely audible on the CCTV audio feed. Caesar rose from his spot, muscles rippling beneath his golden coat, and took a single step forward. The motion caught Marco's attention. He turned slightly too late, the phone still raised. The lion didn't hesitate. He charged. 15 feet of distance vanished in under 2 seconds. Marco flinched, stumbling backward as the camera feed blurred. The impact knocked him flat on his back, his phone spinning away into the dirt. A second camera, mounted from a different angle, captured the precise moment Caesar leapt, claws extended, jaws wide. Marco screamed. The first swipe raked across his left shoulder and neck, tearing through fabric and skin. He rolled instinctively, trying to protect his face, but Caesar was on him before he could regain his footing. The lion's massive front paw landed on Marco's ribcage, pinning him down with crushing force. A second later, Caesar sank his teeth into Marco's side, just below the ribcage. Blood pooled instantly. In the corridor, a junior keeper, returning early from a coffee run, heard the distant sounds and turned toward the enclosure hallway. At first, it was just a noise, a thud, then a muffled cry. But the next sound, a frantic, guttural scream, made her drop her cup and run. Inside the enclosure, Marco was struggling, kicking weakly, trying to crawl backward as Caesar dragged him by the leg. The lion clamped down again, this time on Marco's lower back, shaking violently. His screams grew shorter, raspier. One final twist from the lion's neck, then silence. The junior keeper reached the control panel, slammed the emergency alarm, and triggered the lockdown. Within seconds, sirens echoed through the predator ring. 2 more staff members arrived, fumbling with the emergency tranquilizer kit, but it was no use. By the time they accessed the secondary gate, Marco's body was still, and Caesar was circling, agitated by the noise, blood staining its jaw. Staff used a loud sound deterrent to force Caesar into the holding pen before entering the enclosure. They pulled Marco out under armed watch, but it was already too late. His body bore deep lacerations across the chest, stomach, and back. His skull had been fractured, his ribs crushed under the weight of Caesar's strike. He was pronounced dead before emergency services even arrived. The Sao Paulo Wildlife Park remained closed for 3 days. Behind the scenes, staff were devastated. Marco had been one of them, quiet, reliable, deeply committed. Grief mixed with confusion as news spread that he had bypassed safety systems he once helped train new staff to follow. The footage left no room for speculation. He had acted alone, deliberately, and fatally outside protocol. In the days that followed, the zoo implemented emergency changes. Biometric scanners replaced code-based access for all predator enclosures, and marketing responsibilities were permanently separated from animal care roles. The lion, Caesar, was not euthanized. Authorities ruled that the animal had reacted as any apex predator would when confronted by a human inside its territory. Marco's story is a brutal reminder of what happens when chasing the perfect shot outweighs safety. But the same mistake played out again just 5 years later. No fences, no cages, just a young couple and a silent predator in the wilds of Montana. On August 12, 2019, Sarah and Michael Winscott woke early to the sound of wind moving through the pines outside their rental cabin in West Glacier, Montana. It was their third day in Glacier National Park and the final full day of a trip they'd looked forward to for months. From their home in Seattle, they had planned it as an escape, an anniversary retreat away from the noise of the city and the digital pull of everyday life. Michael, 30, was a software engineer who often sought solitude in nature. Weekdays found him buried in code and system architecture, but weekends were for trails, gear checklists, and long hikes that quieted the mind. Sarah, 28, worked in publishing and had a gentler rhythm. She was reflective and observant with a strong creative streak. What she loved most about the outdoors wasn't the distance covered or elevation gained, but the stillness of it, the way time stretched and softened around trees and mountains. Together, they were grounded. Michael brought order and structure, Sarah brought openness and curiosity. It was the kind of quiet compatibility that revealed itself most clearly out on a trail. They'd spent the day before visiting some of the park's more crowded spots, places with gift shops, overlooked signs, and slow-moving families. Today, they wanted something more personal. They chose the Highline Trail not for its reputation, but for its promise of space, less foot traffic, more silence. It was one of those trails that seemed to unfold with every step, always hinting at something just beyond the bend. By 8:15 a.m., they were already on the move. The trail's early sections offered a mixture of narrow cliffside paths and stretches of shaded forest. The air was cool, still clinging to the remnants of the night. Their conversation was sparse, punctuated by moments of quiet observation. Distant hawks, the rustle of squirrels in the brush, the occasional squeal of a marmot. Occasionally, they'd pause to take in the view or snap a photo. Sarah often carried a compact camera strapped to her backpack, and while she rarely said much while shooting, the slight curve of her mouth revealed how much she enjoyed trying to preserve these passing moments. As the morning stretched on, they moved deeper into the park, away from the popular trailheads. They passed only a handful of other hikers. The sky had cleared and the forest opened up into alpine meadows lined with wildflowers. It felt as if the park belonged to them alone. Around 10:30 a.m., they emerged into a long, open slope of grass and scattered stone. It was quiet, peaceful. Then, about 50 yards ahead, something moved. At first, Sarah thought it might be a bison, but the shape was wrong. Heavier through the shoulders with a sloping back and darker fur. It was a grizzly, large, powerful, and completely absorbed in foraging. Its nose was buried in the soil, searching for roots or insects, entirely unaware of the human presence nearby. Michael reacted immediately. His posture shifted and he slowed his pace, signaling that they needed to put distance between themselves and the animal. Sarah stayed behind him, wide-eyed but calm. Neither of them had ever encountered a bear in the wild before. They knew the theory, of course. They had reviewed the safety brochures, packed bear spray, and mentally rehearsed what to do. But theory meant little when standing on the trail with a predator just up ahead. They didn't speak, but Sarah instinctively pulled out her iPhone and switched to selfie mode. She kept her voice low, barely above a whisper, as she recorded, framing herself with the bear in the blurred background. It wasn't for content or to show off. Just a quiet, impulsive way to capture something that felt unreal. The kind of moment people describe but rarely have proof of. She held the phone steady, barely breathing. Then a breeze cut through the clearing. The bear lifted its head. Its posture shifted subtly, ears forward, body tense. It was no longer foraging, it was assessing. Sarah and Michael began to back away slowly and without sudden movement. The bear watched. It didn't charge, it didn't growl, but it began to follow. At first, it was a walk, one slow step, then another. The couple quickened their pace, retreating down the path without turning their backs. Their movements were deliberate, practiced, exactly as they had been instructed. But the bear's behavior had changed. It wasn't browsing anymore, it was closing the gap. The air had changed. No more birdsong, no more breeze. Just footsteps on gravel and the growing awareness that they were being followed. They moved faster, and the bear followed. The trail narrowed as they moved back the way they had come, a steep drop on one side and thick underbrush on the other. Behind them, the bear continued to follow, slow at first, measured as if trying to decide whether the figures ahead were a threat or a curiosity. But each time Sarah and Michael increased their pace, so did the bear. Its walk became a trot, its head lowered, nostrils flaring, tracking scent and sound with unnerving precision. Then, with no clear signal, it broke into a full charge. The sound was overwhelming. An explosion of movement, of claws scraping against rock, of limbs crushing foliage. The space between them vanished in seconds. Sarah and Michael turned and ran, their boots thudding against the uneven ground, lungs already straining from the altitude and adrenaline. The forest blurred as they fled, but the bear was faster, much faster. Sarah stumbled first. Her foot caught on a rock embedded in the trail's edge, and she collapsed forward, her shoulders slamming against the ground. She tried to rise, but the bear was already there. It struck her from behind, a massive paw raking across her back and tearing through her jacket and into the muscle beneath. She collapsed again under the weight of the impact, arms instinctively drawn around her head. The bear's second swipe landed across her left side, spinning her onto her back. Its claws tore through her ribs and abdomen, opening deep wounds that immediately soaked her clothing in blood. Michael had turned at the sound of her fall and saw everything. Her body twisting under the force of the blow, the blur of fur and movement. He ran back toward her, unsure of what he would do, unsure if anything he did would matter. The bear was fully engaged now, towering over Sarah as it pinned her to the ground. It bit down across her upper torso, its jaws clamping through fabric and flesh, crushing ribs beneath its weight. He stopped just short of the bear's range, instinct holding him back. He reached for the bear spray, fumbled with the cap, raised his arm, but the angle was wrong, the bear was too low, and the chaos too immediate. The spray wouldn't reach, he knew it. The bear didn't even glance in his direction. Its focus remained entirely on Sarah. In a split second of clarity, he realized there was nothing he could do with his bare hands that would change the outcome. The bear was not deterred by shouts, not frightened by the presence of another person. It had decided she was a threat, or prey, or simply too close. Every survival instinct screamed at him to run, and so he did. Michael turned and sprinted. He ran down the trail, his body driven by fear, guilt, and helplessness. Every turn felt like a betrayal, every step away from Sarah like abandoning her again. As he ran, he pulled out his phone, trying to call for help, but there was no signal, just a blank screen and a flashing SOS icon. Nearly 2 miles down the trail, he passed a pair of older hikers resting at a junction. He shouted, waved, didn't slow down. At the intersection of the Highline and Loop trails, he finally reached a volunteer trail steward, an off-duty ranger stationed at a small information post. She saw his panic immediately and radioed park dispatch. All she could report was a frantic man shouting about a bear attack. Rangers trained in backcountry emergencies were dispatched from the nearest station, with others hiking in from nearby trailheads. The terrain was steep, the trails were narrow, it took over an hour for help to reach the site. When they arrived, Sarah was gone. Her body was found roughly 20 feet off the main trail, partially buried beneath a scatter of branches, soil, and crushed vegetation. The bear had cached her, an instinctual behavior, not a predatory one, but a territorial response. Her injuries were catastrophic, multiple lacerations to the back, chest, and abdomen, crushed ribs, and deep puncture wounds along her shoulder and neck. The medical examiner later concluded that she had died within minutes of the initial strike. The bear was gone. There were no signs it had remained nearby, and no additional attacks were reported in the days that followed. The rangers marked the site, flagged off the trail section, and began a careful sweep of the area to ensure no other hikers were at risk. Michael returned with them, but only to identify her body. In the days that followed, Glacier National Park closed the Highline Trail indefinitely. Rangers posted signs, rerouted foot traffic, and began reinforcing their wildlife safety protocols. The investigation concluded quickly. The bear's behavior had been defensive, not predatory. It had been startled, followed its instincts, and responded as wild animals often do when confronted with something unfamiliar and too close. Park officials made the decision not to euthanize the animal. A year later, a small wooden marker was placed near the bend in the trail where the attack occurred. It bore no names, no dates. Just a short inscription etched into its surface. Respect the wild, keep your distance. Sarah's story was a quiet reminder of how quickly nature can turn. But not all predator encounters happen in the wild. In rural Ontario, behind fences and reinforced gates, another tragedy unfolded when a tiger broke through the illusion of safety and claimed a life in a place meant to be secure. On May 23, 2018, the dense pine forest of rural Ontario stood thick and quiet around the remote property known as Northwood's Exotic Animal Haven. The facility wasn't marked by signage or advertised online. It had no entry gate, no visitor hours. From the outside, it looked like a large estate, but beyond the trees stood cages and the low sounds of pacing animals. Robert and Linda Mackenzie had lived there for nearly 22 years. In that time, they had acquired over a dozen exotic animals: lions, leopards, cougars, and more recently, Bengal tigers. Their interest in wildlife began modestly. Rescued servals, a retired zoo leopard. But as their wealth grew, so did their ambitions. Robert and Linda, fueled by money and a shared fascination with big cats, gradually turned their remote property into a personal zoo. Together, they poured time and money into building their collection, creating what they believed was a personal sanctuary. But Northwoods was never officially licensed as a zoo. It operated on the thin edge of private ownership laws, legal enough to avoid scrutiny but far from regulated. The animals were housed in makeshift enclosures, some welded from construction fencing, others modified from livestock pens. Most were built by local contractors without any formal experience in predator containment. Still, to the Mackenzies and their small circle of friends, the place was something to be proud of, something impressive. That Wednesday afternoon, Robert and Linda were entertaining longtime friends David and Catherine Harrington. The two couples had met more than a decade earlier at a private fundraiser in Toronto. David had built his fortune in real estate, and Catherine had a finance background. With their children grown, they often sought out secluded and unusual travel experiences. The Harringtons had visited before, but this time was different. The Mackenzies had a new tiger, Raja, recently acquired from a failed roadside zoo. The afternoon began unremarkably. The couple sat on the Mackenzies' elevated deck, shaded by tall spruce and overlooking the lower half of the property. A breeze carried the faint scent of pine and animal musk. Over wine and late lunch, the couples caught up, surrounded by animals few others ever saw. As the sun began to lower and the second bottle of wine emptied, Robert suggested they walk down to see Raja. He described the tiger in affectionate terms, exaggerating his gentleness, recounting how he'd been calm as a house cat since arriving. There was no urgency in the decision, no group consensus, just a casual agreement to go see the newest addition. The enclosure stood downhill, framed in a 12-foot chain-link fence reinforced with steel. The tiger lay on the concrete, its striped coat vivid in the afternoon light. Robert stood near the outer gate, boasting about Raja's size and behavior. As he spoke, the others stood behind him. David stepped forward for a closer look while Catherine stayed back, phone in hand, casually framing the scene in her camera's viewfinder. Then Robert made a decision. He opened the outer gate and gestured toward the small buffer zone between the two fences. The area was only a few feet wide, a space designed more for feeding than for foot traffic. It wasn't meant for visitors, but there was no warning, no second thought. Robert invited David to step inside for a better photo. It was the kind of casual rule-breaking that felt harmless in the moment, especially between old friends. David stepped in. Inside the enclosure, Raja shifted his weight. He stood, muscles rippling beneath his coat, and moved toward the fence. And for a few moments, everything seemed still. Rajah's movement was slow but purposeful. He stepped forward, eyes fixed on the figure now standing in the narrow buffer zone. The space was small, no more than 4 feet wide, and bordered on one side by the main enclosure and on the other by the outer fence. David remained just outside the inner gate, clearly uncertain, but still facing the tiger. He was smiling faintly, holding his position, waiting for whatever Robert had intended to show him. Behind them, Catherine raised her phone to take another photo. Rajah's body language shifted, ears flattening slightly, tail flicking low and slow, his head tilting downward. Subtle but unmistakable to those who knew what to look for. These were not signs of friendliness, they were cues of focus, tension, and a predator's rising engagement. A moment later, the tiger lunged. He didn't roar, there was no dramatic leap. He simply accelerated forward in a short, explosive burst. His paw hit the fence with such force that a weakly fastened seam split open, giving Rajah access he should never have had. His paw came through first, claws extended, catching David by the forearm and pulling him violently forward. The impact slammed his shoulder into the fence, pinning him. In a flash, Rajah reached farther through the gap, grabbing at whatever flesh he could reach. David tried to pull back, but the tiger's strength overwhelmed him instantly. Catherine screamed. The phone slipped from her hand and hit the ground, the screen still lit. The fence clattered and trembled with every movement as Rajah dragged David's upper body against the metal. His jaws clamped down at the gap, finding David's shoulder, then his neck. Blood sprayed across the gravel. David's legs kicked, boots skidding for grip, but he was held in place, partially inside the enclosure, trapped by the tiger's grip. Robert sprinted to the shed and returned with a fire extinguisher and hose, makeshift tools for a disaster already underway. He returned less than a minute later. Catherine was still frozen near the outer gate, hands shaking, voice cracking as she called for help that wouldn't come fast enough. Robert triggered the extinguisher first, spraying a cloud of white powder into the air near Rajah's face. The tiger paused, disoriented, but didn't release its hold. Robert followed with the hose, directing a jet of cold water at the animal's eyes. It slowed Rajah briefly, but it didn't stop him. Linda called emergency services, struggling to decide their location, unlisted, unmarked, and unfamiliar to dispatchers. The attack lasted just over 4 minutes. During that time, David suffered repeated bites and deep claw lacerations to his chest, shoulder, and neck. One of the bites severed his brachial artery, a critical blood vessel beneath the arm. The loss of blood was immediate and massive. By the time Rajah finally released him, David collapsed against the fence, motionless, his shirt soaked through with blood. Robert dropped the hose and rushed to him, but there was no pulse. 27 minutes after Linda's call, a volunteer fire unit arrived, followed closely by paramedics. The responders found Catherine seated near the outer gate, still in shock. Robert stood with blood-covered hands, silent. David lay on the ground where he had fallen, surrounded by a trail of disturbed dirt, crushed grass, and streaks of red. Attempts at resuscitation failed. David Harrington was pronounced dead during airlift preparation at Sunnybrook Hospital in Toronto. The official cause of death was exsanguination due to a severed artery in the shoulder and multiple puncture wounds. The investigation exposed a chain of preventable failures. The fencing had been compromised, the buffer zone was inadequate, there were no tranquilizers on site, no written emergency procedures, and no formal training. Robert Mackenzie had built his facility on confidence and improvisation, not on safety or oversight. Criminal charges were considered but ultimately dropped. Catherine Harrington pursued a civil suit instead, citing negligence and misrepresentation of risk. The Mackenzies settled out of court, and the remaining animals were quietly removed from the property. Northwoods was shut down for good, and land sold in silence the following year. David Harrington's death led to new laws tightening exotic animal ownership, but no plaques marked the place, only the memory of a quiet afternoon and a fatal mistake. Thanks for watching. If you found this story wild, you're definitely going to love the video waiting for you on your end screen right now. Don't miss it, and I'll see you there.